In the next video clip, you will see that the anti-Christian and anti-Semitic atheists in the Democratic Party are fulfilling Revelation 18:24 by causing the USA to become responsible for all who are slain on the earth, when it reveals that they are aiding and abetting the Muslim terrorists throughout the world by using the public schools in the USA to deceive future generations of Americans about the nature and intentions of the Muslims, in order to cause them to unknowingly support the Muslim terrorists and their supporters that the atheists in the Democratic Party are conspiring with to overthrow the state of Israel and bringing to the USA to build a voter base among, in order to obtain enough votes to take control of the government and overthrow the Judeo-Christian laws and government in the USA and implement an atheist-based socialist government that will outlaw Christianity in the USA. The atheists are also bringing these Muslim terrorists and their supporters to the USA to include their anti-Christian presence in their anti-Christian agenda in the USA, and to allow them to raise money and send it through phony Muslim Brotherhood charity fronts to their favorite Muslim terrorist organizations throughout the earth that are killing Christians and Jews and committing terrorist acts against the state of Israel.
What we did is we looked at 38 books because we wanted to make sure we got a broad cross-section of the books that are out there. And we're pretty sure that probably virtually every school district in America is using one or more of these textbooks, and probably a lot of private schools too. And we looked at this from both ancient history, so the beginnings of Islam, the life of Muhammad, how the textbooks deal with that, all the way up through 9/11 and how they deal with that, and everything in between.
Yeah, and we're going to start, Guy, with early Islam. Now, here's a quote from one of the texts that you have monitored and exposed in the report. It says, "The Quran tells the story of the night journey in which a winged horse took Muhammad, the Islamic prophet, to Jerusalem." Now, that's incorrect on many levels. Number one, they just present it as fact that Muhammad went on the night journey.
Right.
And number two, the Quran never mentions Jerusalem. Mentioned hundreds of times in the Bible, never mentioned in the Quran.
That's correct. That's correct. And what the real implication for that is that the reinsertion of Jerusalem as a holy city for Muslims, many decades after the Quran was given to Muhammad, has been used as the means by which to today deny the rightful place of Israel, and create a situation in the Holy Land where now we have the conflict we have between Muslims, Jews, and Christians.
And there's an attitude out there that the Jewish people never even set foot in Israel and Jerusalem.
That's correct.
And this just reinforces it. Another one, in Medina. This is in a McDougall Little Houghton Mifflin textbook at probably many public schools around the country. And the quote is, in Medina, this is what kids are learning in 6th through 12th grade in American public schools. In Medina, Muhammad displayed impressive leadership skills. He fashioned an agreement that joined his own people with the Arabs and Jews of Medina as a single community. These groups accepted Muhammad as a political leader. As a religious leader, he drew many more converts who found his message appealing. Now, Guy called me crazy, but my reading of Islamic history and Islam's early conquests and Islam's treatment of the Jews in Arabia and in Medina was vastly different of what they're teaching our American school kids.
Very much so. Those who know Islamic history know that there was the Meccan period and the Medinan period. Muhammad left Medina after about 12 years, left Mecca after about 12 years, migrated to Medina, and there he tried to persuade the 3 Jewish tribes that he was their long-awaited final prophet. And that's where you find in the Quran the passages referencing things that are biblical stories and so on, that he probably heard through oral tradition. The Jews in Medina didn't accept that. They didn't accept him as the prophet. They rejected him, and as a result, he expelled 2 of the tribes, seized their lands, and one of the tribes he actually conquered and had about 800 of the men beheaded in one day.
And had the women personally witnessed those beheadings.
He authorized it. He and his wife Aisha, his favorite wife.
That's right.
He authorized the beheading of the men of the tribe and sold the women and children into slavery. So it couldn't be more different than what is being painted there in the textbook. And that's historically accepted fact.
To our impressionable young kids, a captive audience in American public schools, Guy. And it's not even mentioning the Quranic and the references in the Hadiths to Jews as the sons of apes and pigs and cursed by Allah.
Right.
So whitewashed to say the least. Moving on here, and there's so much material here, I think it's going to shock people. I know it's going to shock people. Act for America, education.org. You have to check this report out. Sharia, Islamic Sharia law and the treatment of Christians and Jews. Once again, McDougall, Little, Houghton, Mifflin, World History Book, Patterns of Interaction. In 2007, key point here, Guy, most of these books in the report were written after 9/11.
That's correct, post 9/11.
Post 9/11. Here's what they're saying about Sharia. Sharia law requires Muslim leaders to extend religious tolerance to Christians and Jews. And here's another one. The Muslims were extremely tolerant of those they conquered as long as they were people of the book. The Muslims allowed Christians and Jews to keep their churches and synagogues and promised them security. Islam respected Jews and Christians. I don't know, Guy. I don't know that that's exactly correct. Can you kind of enlighten us a bit? You're a former teacher. Can you enlighten us?
Let's say that in some times and in some places there was a degree of tolerance extended to Christians and Jews by their Muslim conquerors. The early years of the Muslim conquest of Spain, for instance. But generally speaking, the rule was anything but. And there's nothing in Sharia law that requires Muslim leaders to extend tolerance towards Christians and Jews. And this idea that there was full religious freedom granted, well, let me refer to one Muslim historian who estimated that about 30,000 Christian churches were destroyed during the first 2 centuries of jihad after Muhammad died. You know, these are historical facts that are not hard to find. We're in the age of the internet, for Pete's sake. You can find this stuff, and yet in the textbooks we see this pattern over and over and over again. Revisionism, bias, just plain flat out things that aren't true.
Sharia is tolerant of Jews and Christians?
Well, here's the funny thing about that. If that was the case, there'd have to be a whole lot of jihadist leaders, sultans, and so on through the history of Islam that would have to be apologizing for how they treated Christians and Jews, if that were in fact the case.
One of the things that our enemies say, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, they say, look, we are waging a jihad against you, America. Well, here's what our American public school kids are learning about jihad. You and I think of it as a military offensive against the infidel. This is what our kids are learning. According to Houghton Mifflin, a major American textbook company, jihad is an Islamic term that is often misunderstood. The term means to struggle, to do one's best to resist temptation and overcome evil. Under certain conditions, the struggle to overcome evil may require action. The Quran and Sunnah allow self-defense and participation in military conflict, but restrict it to the right to defend against aggression and persecution. Never offensive jihad, Guy. So half of the known world back in the 7th, 8th century became Islamic only through, I guess, defensive jihad. This had nothing to do with conquest. At least that's what our kids are learning in American public schools.
Well, I believe that same textbook, if I remember, if it's that one, talks about the actual Islamic conquests and describes how Muslim armies crossed the Mediterranean to invade Spain. They crossed the Mediterranean to invade Italy. They invaded the Middle East. They invaded Asia Minor. And of course, it begs the obvious question: if jihad is only for defensive, none of those were defensive actions. So the textbook was contradicting its own definition when it described the Islamic conquest.
But
now, the average student isn't going to catch that.
But I mean, hey, it says here that this is just the Quran and Sunnah allow jihad only in self-defense.
Right.
They restrict it to the right to defend against it. This flies in the face of history, and it flies in the face of Islam's core texts.
That's correct. And if you study the jurisprudential history of Islam, you will find that jihad is commonly understood as militant action against the infidel. There are 199 passages in the Sahih Bukhari hadith. It is considered one of the 2 most authoritative hadith.
Yes.
Every one of them refers to jihad in respect to conquest or violence. What has happened in the last 30, 40 years in the West is we've had this kind of repackaging of jihad for Western consumption. To treat it as, I like the way Dr. Waleed Ferris puts it, is treated as Islamic yoga. Right. And there is a small element of that
spiritual striving.
And there is. But it is far overshadowed historically, doctrinally, by militant advancing of the faith.
That is the mainstream interpretation.
It is the
This
mainstream
means holy
interpretation,
war.
and it's what they understood historically.
Yeah.
It's why they expanded. In 200 years, they swept out of Arabia, and Islamic armies developed an empire from the Atlantic Ocean on the west all the way to India on the east. They didn't do it through handing out tracts.
No. And real quick, we have about 30 seconds, Guy, but the Crusades, which was kind of a counter-jihad in many ways, what are these textbooks saying about the Crusades?
The biggest thing they do with the Crusades is they treat them as if the Muslims were indigenous to the Holy Land and the Christians were invaders coming in to try to oust them out of the Holy Land. Yeah. When in fact the Muslims invaded the Holy Land about 4.5 centuries prior to the Crusades. And so this was a Christian counteroffensive or counterattack, if you will.
Yeah, they give the impression that it was always Muslim land.
Correct, that's correct.
And that's the impression the Muslims want to give.
That's exactly correct.
You know, Guy, moving on to 9/11, which I think shaped the view of many people's take on Islam, on jihad, on the enemy we're facing. When these textbooks talk about 9/11, you show this again and again in the report, when these textbooks talk about 9/11, they mention terrorism and a terrorist attack, but they never mention Islam or that the attackers were Muslim.
That's correct. That's correct. What they do is the closest they'll get to it is they'll mention Al-Qaeda, but they don't typically define what Al-Qaeda is or describe it. It's really a remarkable thing. This can't be accidental. It would be like 10 years, 11 years after Pearl Harbor, the textbooks describing Pearl Harbor as an enemy fleet attacked our base at Pearl Harbor with bombs and torpedoes, never told us who they were, never told us why they did it, and somehow we're supposed to understand historically what happened.
6th through 12th grade American students in the most formative years. Now, 9/11 was a pivotal turning point, not only in American history, but world history. It literally changed the world.
That's correct.
And these young, impressionable kids aren't even learning that 9/11 had a link to Islam.
To Islamic jihad. That's correct. And a lot of these kids weren't old enough to remember 9/11.
Right.
So we're talking, this is something they've heard about, and now they're getting a revisionist view of history from only 11 years ago. We're not talking ancient history of 14 centuries ago now. It's pretty remarkable.
What are the ramifications, Guy, what are the ramifications of this? I mean, it's alarming, it's disturbing. I know I'm going to be getting viewer email here. People are going to be outraged. What are the larger ramifications here?
Well, I see two ramifications here. The first is for the individual parent and grandparent who have kids in the schools or grandkids in the public schools. We run into this as we travel the country, Brigitte and I. We'll have people come up to us and say, my child, adult child or my grandchild, we talk to them about radical Islam, we talk to them about these types of issues, and they dismiss it. They say, no, there's no truth to that. Islam has always been tolerant, has always been a peaceful religion. Where are they getting that from? They're getting it from the textbooks they're getting in the schools. They're getting a one-sided view.
And our decision makers, our government leaders, intelligence officials, the State Department.
That's the broader ramification.
Products, yes.
That's the broader ramification, is what does this mean with respect to government policy and how we deal with the threat of Islamic terrorism, stealth jihad, and what does this mean for the next 15, 20, 25 years?
It's a long
When
war.
these young people become adults, they're now voters, and they take this worldview into the voting booth. Are we going to be able to persuade them that, in fact, this is a real threat, not just a few isolated extremists, but something that has been the warp and woof of Islam for 14 centuries? Are we going to be able to do this when they've been taught this way? You know, Hitler said it well. He said, give me the children and I'll change society in 10 years. Stalin understood that. Mao understood that. All these
and the Saudis understand that.
And the Saudis understand it. We need to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, Guy, our enemies must be licking their chops.
According to Revelation 17:16, when the Antichrist sees that the earthquake that John saw and recorded in Revelation 16:18 through 19 renders the USA defenseless, he will talk to 10 leaders of the Muslim terrorists and their supporters that the atheists in the Democratic Party are bringing to the USA into joining him in a common purpose and defeat the USA militarily.